Hi there, I have 4 materials that dye fibers pink. I'm using cochineal, madder root, mixed berries, and avocado pits. I have several natural dyeing videos that go hand in hand with this video. I have a scouring video, which is all about how to clean your fibers so that they take on as much pigment as possible. And after that, 2 mordanting videos, one on protein or animal fibers and one on cellulose or plant fibers, how to mordant them, which is applying a material to the surface of the fabric so that they absorb as much pigment as they can and are as light proof as possible. I mordant with alum acetate on the plant fibers and alum sulfate on the animal fibers, and you can find those linked in the description below as well as up here throughout this video. So today I'm going to be dyeing pink with these different materials, and each one creates a slightly different shade and different light fastness. With the cochineal and the madder root on alum mordanted fibers, they will be light fast. They will last quite a while without fading. Berries are fugitive dyes, which means that once they're applied to the fiber, they will fade quickly in light. So if the fiber is left in direct sunlight, they will fade quickly, and over time with washes, the dye will disappear. Avocados have more of a light fastness. They actually darken in sunlight. I did a couple tests on some wool yarn, and the fiber once dyed with avocado darkened slightly in the sunlight. So it went from a peach to a slightly deeper peach. So let's start out by prepping these materials for the dye pot. With the avocado pits, we'll do these first. You're going to cut them into small pieces, and be very careful when you're doing this because they are super slippery and it could be easy to cut your hand. So cut with a sharp knife, not a dull knife, so that you don't accidentally cut your hand. You can still cut your hand with a sharp knife. It's just apparently a thing that if you cut with a dull knife, you are more likely to cut yourself, which I don't really understand, but it's a thing, I guess. So try to cut by putting the knife on the pit and pressing down without having your fingers touching the pit whatsoever. Cut it in half and then into quarters, like so, and then cut across again. And one more time for good measure. And then you can add these to your dye pot. See, it slips like that. So it may take a few kind of teetering back and forth to get a good grip on the pit before you can press down all the way. And then cut in half. Again. And depending on the size of the pit, you'll want chunks that are about nickel sized. The colors that all of these dye materials produce will depend on when you're harvesting the materials themselves. Madder and cochineal you usually buy from a dye producer, but avocado pits, berries, and other dye materials that you harvest from a garden or use from the grocery store, it will depend on when the object was harvested and how much pigment each thing has will determine the color of your finished product. And the more avocado pits that you add to your dye bath, the deeper the color you'll end up with, because you'll have more pigment opportunity. And there is our avocados all processed and ready for the dye bath. Now berries are really easy. I'm just using a mixed berry from the frozen section at my grocery store. I'm just going to dump these into the pot and they are ready to go. And for madder and cochineal, these come in either a powder form or a whole form. Cochineal is a beetle that is harvested, and the shell of the beetle produces a bright pink color. Madder, this one's a powder. The cochineal, this one's a solid. When working with these, I like to wear a dust mask so that I'm protected from breathing any of the particles in. So I'm going to put this on. and then use a measuring spoon to measure out a half a tablespoon per material. So I'm going to put a half a tablespoon of the cochineal in. And for my dye baths, I'm doing samples of different fibers to show you how they dye on cotton, linen, silk, and wool. So I'm just using a small amount of each of these materials. You'll want to extend out the amount of material you're using depending on how much yardage of fabric you want to dye or amount of yarn you're dyeing. And then for the madder root, I'm going to use a whole tablespoon. And the amount you use will also determine the depth of color that you end up with. Now these baths are ready for me to add water, so I'm going to add enough water over the dye material to cover them with about an inch extra over top, because it will start to evaporate off as you're extracting the pigment. And for the cochineal and the madder, I'm going to work with about 1/4 to 2 quarts of water per dye for the extraction process. Like so. Now we'll put all of these pots on the stove and cook them. Now we'll put all of these pots on the stove and begin extracting pigment by putting them on low to medium heat. For the madder root, I will put it at medium, cochineal at medium, the berries at low so that it doesn't cook and start to brown the juices, and the avocados at medium. And then they can simmer or stay at that temperature to extract the pigment for 2 to 6 hours depending on the material. Madder root, I would suggest 6 hours, cochineal 6 hours, berries about 4 hours, and avocados about 6 hours as well. But you can do a range of 2 to 6 to extract dye and get a different depth of color. I have several different materials I want to show you that produce a dye or dye-like pigment. First of all, I have some lavender, rose, and lemon juice. This dyed brown on wool. This is wool yarn and wool fabric, but I got a pink tone on my linen and kind of a pink blush on my cotton muslin, which was interesting. I did a lavender petal and rose petal tea and then added some lemon juice and dyed these guys in that juice, and that's what it produced. This is horse chestnut husks, processing the horse chestnuts just like we're doing with the other baths in this video, and dyeing this wool fiber. Ended up with this nice peachy pink color. These are avocado dyed materials. These are all from the pits. This is a silk fiber dyed in avocado pit, a cotton jacquard weave, and 2 pieces of cotton muslin. I got a slightly different color of the peachy tone on these fibers. This is cotton fiber with madder root, and this is a really light fiber. This was a dye pot that I used at the end after dyeing other things in it, and I just threw this in. So this is an exhaust dye using the leftover dye. So I got a nice light pink color. This is the cotton before I exhaust dyed it, so you can see it's a bit darker. This is madder root on wool fibers, so I ended up with kind of an orangey red. And then these are madder root on a wool fiber and a wool yarn, and I did these in my solar dyeing video. You can check that out up here, how to solar dye with madder root, which is a cool technique, a little bit different than the heat extraction that we're doing here. This is hibiscus petals, ended up with kind of a brownish pink, and then mixed berry like we're doing today on wool. This is hibiscus petals on wool. And then this is cochineal. It ends up a nice deep red if you use a concentration of the cochineal. This is wool fiber and a wool yarn. So lots of different things that you can produce pinks with, and play with the different shades depending on how much dye material you add to your dye bath. using less dye material will produce a lighter color, more will produce a deeper color, and different fibers take on colors slightly differently. So animal fibers like wool and silk tend to take on color more deeply, more vibrantly than cotton and hemp and linen will do. So those fibers will be a little bit lighter, like these cottons compared to this wool on the madder root. We will be doing samples of multiple different fibers with each of our dye baths so I can show you how each one shows the color differently. If you enjoy natural dyeing, like this video because it'll help me make more natural dyeing videos. Put the pot of dye on a heat source and turn it on. Work in a well-ventilated area outside or with windows open, fans, and an exhaust fan. Allow to slowly heat over several hours. Add water to the dye bath if the water level starts getting low. Stir every half hour or so to check the dye color. You will begin to see it darken as pigment is extracted. Knowing when to strain out the dye material takes practice. Typically, if the water begins to look colorful, it has pigment that will dye fiber. The darker or deeper the color, the better. Strain out the dye material and the dye liquid into a bowl. Clean out the pot and then transfer the dye back to the pot. Place back on the heat source and set the temperature to what you want for dyeing fiber. Typically, I set this at a medium heat. Add your fibers and submerge into the dye. Pre-mordanted fibers that have been dried will take a few minutes to absorb the water and become wet. If you want an even result from your dye bath, you want to pre-wet your fiber so that it's completely wet when you put it in your pot. Allow your fibers to soak in the dye for 2 to 6 hours, depending on what dye material you are using, and stir about every 15 minutes to make sure that the dye transfers evenly on the fabric or fibers. Allow the fibers to steep in the dye until the fabric looks several shades darker than what you want as it fades with rinsing and drying, or until the fibers seem to have stopped absorbing pigment. You'll begin to see it darken as it sits in the dye bath. When you're ready to rinse your fibers, I suggest transferring your fibers to a bowl and then running cool water over your swatches or fabric, fiber, whatever it is you dyed until the water runs clear. So here I am rinsing them off in multiple baths of fresh, clean water and then squeezing out excess dye and excess water and then setting aside my swatches as soon as I've squeezed out any excess dye. So this is one of the times that the color begins to fade as you rinse out any excess dye that's on the fabric. And then the next step is to lay them out flat to dry in a well-ventilated area. And that's another time where they'll begin to fade with the air drying. The outcome of this batch of berries surprised me and came out purple and tealy. Madder covers a range of orangey reds to salmon pink. The cochineal shows up dramatically on wool yarn when lots of dye material is used, and then bright pinks show on the silk, cotton, linen, and wool swatches. I talked about lavender, rose petals, and lemon juice turning pink on linen. Avocado pits are always a different shade each time you dye with them. Here they're a beigey pink. Like this video if you want to see more natural dyeing videos from me and to support my channel. Subscribe and hit the bell if you want to get notified of new videos that I put out, and check the links in the description below for tools and materials, and sign up for my email update list. I send out a twice-a-month email with lots of resources and tools on all these different fiber arts. Thanks so much for watching and happy natural dyeing. I'll see you next time. Dime size, or what's the other one called? Man, I haven't used coins in a while. Dime, nickel.